A very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Very good evening from London, and welcome all of you, our viewers, to tonight. With me, Henry Gombya, we have a a good good subject for you. We have a guest in the studios already, and tonight we're going to be talking about the way the West prescribes us, especially how Africans have been depicted in the Western world, especially in the Western media, as people who have no culture, people who have no where they come from. And we have a special guest, my friend, my colleague, Professor of Journalism, Columbia Graduate School, Milton Alimadi, is with me tonight in the studio. Professor Alimadi, thank you so much for being with us tonight. And can I ask you kindly to say hello to all our viewers before we sing the national anthem?
Yes, of course. I greet all your viewers, sisters and brothers. I'm very honored to be on your show. I've heard many good things about your show, so I look forward to a very fruitful discussion this evening. Thank you, and thank you to all your viewers as well.
Thank you so much. And let's play the Ugandan national anthem. And to honor Professor Alimadi, we're also going to play the Acholi national anthem after the Ugandan national anthem.
Sure.
Oh, Uganda, may God uphold thee. We lay our future in thy hand. United, free for liberty, together we'll always stand. Oh, Uganda, the land of freedom, our love and labor we give, and we've neighbors all at our country's calling, peace and friendship.
We're now going to play the Acholi national anthem. Sorry, we'll bring it up.
Kucho
For me, having these signature anthems makes my day. I don't know
Oh,
about you, Milton. What do you think about it?
likewise. It takes me back all the way to our beloved ancestral lands, you know. I've not been in Uganda, that's as yourself, for many, many years. So these are the kind of moments that allow you to transport yourself back to the homeland. That is the power of
Exactly.
music, of course. Yes.
And ladies and gentlemen who have joined us today, we are so happy that you are with us. We have tonight my colleague, as I've said before, and my friend, Professor Milton Alimadi. Alimadi is a son of my friend again, who was Prime Minister of Uganda, uh, Eric Otema Alimadi. He was a very good friend of mine. I cannot forget the times that I had with your father here in London. We used to
Thank you.
meet every day at Earl's Court and talk about what was going on in Uganda at that time.
Yes, yes, yes.
And I'm sure he told you about it. We met every day
Yes,
and we
yes, yes.
shared dinner and tonic with him. And Milton, for you and I, you are the publisher of the Black Star News newspaper
Yes.
in New York. And I don't know, and I've not read of any other Black African or African newspaper in New York. It seems like you are the first person who ever started that in New York. Is that true?
Well, there was a second one by the late Chika Onyani, the African Sun Times. He was a very good brother, a very good comrade. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
he passed away a few years ago. And I think
Okay.
after he passed away, the publication also ceased production. Yeah, so it was the two of us, me and the late Chika Onyani, a comrade from Nigeria.
But I hope that because we can't live forever, if your time and my time goes, there's somebody else who can take over because we really want that Black Star News
Yeah.
to happen. Because I have one of our producers who is online, who's behind the
Mm.
scenes right here, and she's very, very proud of what you've done. She's
Thank you.
in British Columbia in Canada, and later on in the program, she'll come on and give you her questions. Now,
Thank you.
Professor,
To go back
first
to
of
the point
all,
you just made,
yeah, go ahead.
we have to have a session. So I have a managing editor now also, and I have other
Yeah,
assistant editors to continue so that even when
yeah,
we are no longer on this earth, the process can continue. So that's very important. Thanks for bringing that up.
very good. Now, you brought up a subject when I approached you to appear on this program. You told me about the book that you've written. I had not heard about it, but since you told me that. I've gone around and I've seen that you have even been appearing on other programs and talking about it. The
Yes.
way we Africans or we black people have been
Right.
betrayed by the white community. Up
Right.
to now, Professor, I can tell you that a lot of people up to now do not really believe that in Africa there are people who are living comfortably in as nice as houses as we have here in the West. They think
Right.
that maybe some of us here, there in Africa, they still live in trees. They still
Absolutely.
live in a downtrodden. They have no idea of what living comfortably is all about.
Right.
You have written a book, and I want you to tell our viewers about your book. What exactly are you trying to say in your book?
Sure. Sure. Very good. Well, the book, as you pointed out, is called "Manufacturing Hate: How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media." And this is something that actually fascinated me even when I was a teenager. Many years ago when my family was living in Tanzania. And I'm sure many young Africans go through this process where you wonder, why is it that in Western media, Africans are portrayed as quote unquote tribal people, less civilized, inferior intellectually, morally, spiritually, uh, physiologically, relative to Europeans. So it bothered me, even as a very young person, in my teenage years. I used to read a lot. You know, as you got to know my father quite well, and you know he was always reading the news, right? So from an early age, to send me to buy the newspapers. So I started reading newspapers when I was about 12. And then I started going to the U.S. Information Service Center, and I would read Western publications. And that's where I started really getting extremely annoyed at the way Africans or Black people generally were depicted. But as a 12 or 13-year-old, there's not much you can do about it, you see? In fact, even when I was in college as an undergraduate at Syracuse University studying economics, one of the classes, my English class, the professor was talking about Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness. And he was really ecstatic when he was describing all these, reading these passages from Conrad's book. And of course, as Chinua Achebe famously pointed out in his essay, which I agree with totally, Conrad was a thoroughgoing racist. And you had all these passages from Conrad. For example, there's one famous scene where the narrator is describing Africans standing along the shores of the riverbank and describe them like people that had come from a mental asylum. That's how he was depicting Africans, um, as very savage, and saying to the narrator that it bothered him that I could somehow be related to these people who were so backward. But then said, well, they are at a place where we were thousands of years ago. Now, at that time, I'm what, maybe 18 as an undergrad, right? And the professor is praising it. The other students are also enjoying it. And the professor saying this is one of the best writings in the English language. And I was sitting there in the class, literally suffering, but I was
This,
not uh, equipped with the knowledge and the history to counter the professor and to say, listen, you're wrong. And these are the reasons why you're wrong. This is denigrating Africans. So how can you praise it and say this is the best, some of the best writing in the English language? It was not
mm,
until I attended the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia in the 1990s that I said, you know what? Now I have an opportunity to do the research because you're required to do a master's paper. I said, let my master's paper focus on how the Europeans who first encountered Africans disseminated information about the Africans. What were their perception, right? What was the motive behind it? And how was that uh, image of quote unquote savage Africa uh, became so universally accepted? So that it's not
mm,
only in the European world that Africans are regarded as inferior, but even if you go to South America, if you go to Asia, Africans are generally regarded and believed to be inferior relative uh, to non-Africans. You see?
if I
So
if
I,
I can stop,
right.
if I can stop there for a minute, I
Yes, of course.
spent some time in Boston, Massachusetts, about 15 years ago, and I found this African American, and we were working together. There was a project I was working on, and working together, and something um, injured my hand, and he ran
Mm.
away. He said, "Oh no, you're an African. I don't want to get I don't want to get anything because I know you guys from Africa, you're infected with HIV. I didn't have an HIV at all. And this guy really literally ran away from me because he's an African American, but he was fearing that as me coming from Africa, I was
Yes,
inferior to him, and
of course.
I bring it to him. That's is about what you're about to say.
Of course. And we encounter that all the time. And it's not surprising. And I discuss that in my book as well. The centuries of demonization of Africa and Africans, quite surprising. It would not be shocking that our sisters and brothers, our African American sisters and brothers, would want nothing to do with Africa. I actually describe a speech by Malcolm X, you know, the brilliant Malcolm X, who analyzed it and explained. He said the Europeans, when they controlled Africa during colonial rule, they projected the image of Africa negatively as savages, as cannibals, as backward people, as uncivilized. And he said, quite naturally, you and I, and he's talking about him as an African American, wanted nothing to do with Africa, let alone anybody refer to us as Africans. And he said, but what actually made the Nation of Islam popular? As you know, he was a black Muslim. That's how they
Yeah.
were described before Nation of Islam. He said, was because they embraced their African culture, the African heritage, the African history, African civilization. And he said, deep down in the back of his mind, an African American uh, has that appreciation for Africa. He just has to be educated to get beyond that myth and demonization. And in the case of Malcolm X, he went beyond that. Malcolm visited several African countries, met many African
Yes, he did.
leaders. He met
Yes.
Nyerere, he met Sekou Touré, he met Kwame Nkrumah, he met Abdel
Yes.
Nasser. Because Malcolm was trying to really uh, uh, bring that connection between
Bri-
Africans in
kind
diaspora
of get a bridge.
and Africans in the continent. Absolutely, to bridge that gap. And he knew, in
Yeah.
fact, his own activism and fight against racism in the United States was inspired by the liberation struggle. And he knew that a good synergy between Africans here in diaspora and Africans on the continent would benefit both sides. And unfortunately, of course, Malcolm was prematurely killed. And I, up to date, believe that one of the reasons why he was eliminated was because he was making that critical connection between African Americans and the African continent. The most
Yes.
important thing he was trying to do was to get African leaders to take the issue of white American racism to the United Nations. He said, so long as we approach it as a civil rights issue, the American system is in control. They will only allow us as much as they want to allow us. But because African leaders have the capacity to raise the issue at the United Nations, now it becomes a human rights issue, an international issue. The system cannot hide it under the rug anymore. And when all the eyes of the world are focused against Black people in this country, the system would back off and make the concessions that they had failed to make before that. I think because, and this is why I say I think that's why he was killed. Because when Malcolm was in African countries and trying to convince African leaders to take the issue to the UN, at the same time, the State Department was sending officials to undermine him and to meet with these same leaders and say, no, Malcolm is a racist and all that nonsense. They knew how critical this issue was. So even though his own so-called colleagues may have pulled the trigger to assassinate him, as you know, there could always be puppet masters in the back.
Okay. Professor, let us go back to your book, which is the main theme of our conversation with you tonight. Manufacturing hate. What exactly are you trying to tell people?
Thank you for that question. I say manufacturing hate because it was done by design, deliberately. In other words, African people and people of African ancestry were demonized for a specific agenda. In the past, it was first of all to justify enslavement of African people, taking them into the so-called New World. Because in order to treat human beings like animals, you have to condition the mindset of your population to accept that they're not equal to you. You see? Otherwise, they would ask questions. Why are you treating other human beings this way? So it was important to convince Europeans that Africans were, in fact, not on par with Europeans. So that's why I say manufacturing hate, a hate which was concocted with a deliberate agenda to justify the exploitation of enslavement. And then later, it was the same thing, but now the new form of slavery was colonization. So in order to colonize Africa, exploit the people's labor, take over their land, commit even massacres, you had to convince Europeans that we were not really killing human beings. We were killing people who looked somehow like human beings, but were not fully human. And that is the purpose for demonization. So for example, Samuel Baker, even today, I've complained many times. Why do we have a school in Uganda, in my ancestral homeland, called Sir Samuel Baker Secondary School? It's because we don't know the history of Samuel Baker. Samuel Baker, in his book, Albert Nyanza, wrote that the African should not be compared to the noble character of the dog. You see? That's what he said. That was one of the many ugly things he wrote about Africans. He said, in fact, it was a great mistake to end slavery. He said during slavery, Black people were very productive. But now that you've ended slavery, they've become lazy, they've become intriguers, they've become always wanting to undermine Europeans. In other words, he was turning everything upside down, you see? And yet this is the Samuel Baker who not only do we honor him with the name of a school. A few years ago, the alum of Samuel Baker Secondary School actually did a collection. They raised funds not to send students to build a statue honoring Samuel Baker. And they did build that statue, and it's in front of the school. They're honoring somebody who said they should not be compared to the noble character of the dog. Now, here's the key thing. First of all, Samuel Baker, of course, did not discover anything. The Europeans did not discover anything in Africa. All those great monuments, the lakes, the rivers, the mountains, they had African names. Okay? So why do we have a Lake Victoria in Uganda today? That's nonsense. That's
So
number one. Number
if
two,
if I stopped you there, would you be in support of changing the name Lake Victoria to another name? Because when I was growing up, I knew that lake as Lake Naluwali. That's a
absolutely.
Ugandan name. Yeah,
That
a
is the
Ugandan
key.
name for
Of
that
course, the
lake.
answer is yes. Articles advocating for that. Because by doing that, we are also decolonizing our minds. Part of the problem why we as African people have not realized our potential is because we engage too much in European worshiping. You see? And that also explains why you have a Sir Samuel Baker Secondary School in Uganda, because of that European worshiping, that, oh, a European actually visited this part of Uganda, were meant to justify colonial rule, which came a few decades later after these so called explorers came there. These so called explorers were actually spies, they were scouts. They went to all these African countries to map where they're located, And in fact, in the case of Baker, he does not hide it. He says the best outcome is we can engage in productive commerce between Europe. We sell them goods that they don't have, and from them, the organization had a purpose. He was not abusing Africans just randomly. He was abusing them to justify. So there was premeditation and concoction. And that is ultimately why I went with the title Manufacturing. There was malicious intent
Could you
behind
kindly
this.
put a book on display so that our viewers can see it?
Yes, yes, of course. This is the book, Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media.
Okay.
And I went beyond the explorers, though, because the explorers created the template that was then adopted by professional media organizations, such as National Geographic, such as the New York Times, and later in the 20th century, other publications like Time Magazine, Newsweek, the New Yorker magazine, which is another influential magazine. So I studied all of them, I picked them, I analyzed them, and I put them in the book. Now, what actually was sort of very rewarding were the documents that I discovered in the archives of the New York Times. They were disturbing. I knew the racism that existed, in contemporary era and in the earlier era, when the New York Times started writing consistently about Africa in the 50s and 60s and 70s. After I did the research, I wanted to speak with some of the reporters. And I was told that many of them had retired. That's way back in the 90s, not like today. Today, you can just go online and easily research and find somebody.
Yes.
So it was suggested that perhaps I might go and do research in the archives. So now I'm telling you, Henry, today, that they did not know what they had in their archives. Otherwise, they would not have allowed me access. I went, I discovered some of the most racist correspondence between editors here in New York and the reporters they sent to Africa, right?
Mhm.
I discovered, in fact, I discovered a letter from a reporter named Lloyd Garrison, who covered the
Yeah,
Biafra War.
yeah,
And he's
yeah.
a descendant of the famous abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison. So he was complaining after he read his own article that he wrote. He said, who
Who was complaining
inserted that?
about it?
No, no, he was complaining because somebody had inserted a description of Nigerians dressed in grass leaf skirts. Imagine. He never saw this and he never wrote about it. But when his article came to New York, editors sitting here in New York felt we need to create a quote unquote tribal scene in Nigeria. So they manufactured this out of thin air. The Nigerians dressed in grass leaves and they put it into their own reporter's story. These are the type of
Mil-
concoctions.
Milton,
Um,
if
um,
I could stop you, if I could stop you there for a minute, when you say
yes.
that, as in that play in the hands of comments by the former U.S. president, who said that there's fake news.
He just concluded that yes, indeed,